On the night of December 11, 1944, a group of soldiers did something that had never been done before and has never been done since. They used tanks to sink warships. Not one ship, 5 ships, in 18 minutes, from the beach, with 0 casualties. The United States Army investigated afterward because no one in command believed it had actually happened. This is that story. The island of Leyte sits in the central Philippines, a humid green wound of jungle and coral and mountains that in late 1944 had become one of the most contested pieces of ground on Earth. General Douglas MacArthur had returned, just as he promised, wading ashore in October with photographers in tow, and the full weight of American industrial might behind him. But the Japanese had no intention of letting him keep it. Leyte was the gateway to Luzon, to Manila, to the heart of what remained of the Japanese Empire in Southeast Asia, and Tokyo had decided that this island, this single strip of mud and blood, would be where the American advance stopped. They were wrong, but they did not know it yet, and so they kept coming. Men, ships, ammunition, rice, medicine, artillery, everything they could scrape together from garrisons across the Pacific, all of it funneled toward Leyte in a desperate attempt to reinforce the island before it was too late. The Americans knew this. They knew the Japanese were running convoys down from Manila and Cebu, trying to slip reinforcements into the western shore of Leyte under cover of darkness. They knew the routes, they knew the timing, and they knew the stakes. The Japanese could not be allowed to land. Every soldier who made it ashore was another week of fighting, another 100 American casualties, another delay in the march toward Tokyo. And so the Navy patrolled, the Air Force bombed, and the infantry dug in along the coast, waiting for whatever came next. What came next, no one expected. The 77th Infantry Division had landed at Ormoc Bay on December 7, 1944. They were not young men. Most of them were in their 30s, some in their 40s, called up in the draft and pulled from jobs and families because the war needed bodies and there were not enough 18-year-olds left to fill the ranks. The division had earned a nickname for this. They called themselves the Old Bastards. It was not official. It was not printed on their insignia or mentioned in dispatches. But every man in the unit knew it, and every man who fought alongside them knew it too. They were older, slower, less enthusiastic than the kids who had stormed the beaches in the early years of the war. They did not sing as much. They did not joke as much. But they were stubborn and they were mean and they did not quit. They had fought in Guam. They had fought in the Marianas. They had seen enough of the Pacific to know what worked and what did not. And by the time they hit the beach at Ormoc, they had stopped caring about anything except staying alive and finishing the job. Ormoc Bay itself was a crescent of dark water on the western side of Leyte, sheltered by hills and thick with the smell of salt and rotting vegetation. The town of Ormoc sat at the inland edge of the bay, a collection of wooden buildings and dirt roads that had been flattened by American naval gunfire before the landing. The 77th had taken the beach with relatively little resistance, but they knew the Japanese were close. Patrols reported movement in the hills. Artillery rounds came in sporadically from the jungle, and every night the horizon flickered with distant lights as Japanese ships tried to slip past American patrols and unload their cargo before dawn. It was a race, and both sides knew it. If the Japanese could land enough men, they could push the Americans back into the sea. If the Americans could hold the beach and cut off the reinforcements, the island would fall. There was no middle ground. On the night of December 10th, the division had set up a perimeter along the beach. Foxholes, machine gun nests, mortar positions, everything arranged in overlapping fields of fire to stop an infantry assault. But no one had given much thought to what they would do if the Japanese came by sea. The Navy was supposed to handle that. Destroyers, PT boats, aircraft. The whole apparatus of American naval power was supposed to intercept convoys before they got close enough to matter. But the Navy could not be everywhere, and the Japanese were getting better at slipping through. On the night of December 11th, they tried again. Corporal James Mackenzie was 29 years old and had been in the Army for 2 years. He was from Pennsylvania, a steel town outside Pittsburgh where he had worked in a foundry before the draft notice came. He was not an officer. He was not a hero. He was a tank destroyer crewman, assigned to the 632nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 77th Infantry Division for the Ormoc Landing. His vehicle was an M10, a tracked armored fighting vehicle built on a modified Sherman chassis and armed with a 3-inch gun designed to punch through the armor of German Tiger tanks. It was a good weapon for what it was built to do. It was not built to fight ships. The M10 was open-topped, which made it vulnerable to artillery and grenades, but kept the weight down and the crew from suffocating in the heat. The gun could traverse 360 degrees, which gave it flexibility that a fixed gun did not have. The armor was thin, just enough to stop small arms fire and shrapnel, but not enough to stop a direct hit from anything larger than a machine gun. It was fast, maneuverable, and deadly against other armored vehicles. Against a ship, it should have been useless. The 3-inch gun fired armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate steel plate at close range and detonate inside a tank's crew compartment. The rounds were not high explosive. They were not designed to blow holes in wooden hulls or set fuel tanks on fire. They were designed to kill tanks. But on the night of December 11th, there were no tanks. There were only ships. Mackenzie and his crew had positioned their M10 on a low ridge overlooking the bay, about 200 yards from the water. It was not a fighting position. It was a precaution. The battalion commander had ordered the tank destroyers to spread out along the beach in case the Japanese tried to land armor, which they had done on other islands and which everyone agreed would be a disaster if it happened here. So the crews sat in their vehicles, smoked cigarettes, and watched the water. The night was hot and still. The sky was overcast, no moon, no stars, just a thick black ceiling that pressed down on the bay like a lid. The water was invisible. The hills were invisible. Everything beyond 20 feet was a wall of darkness, and the only sound was the rhythmic slap of waves against the shore and the occasional pop of distant gunfire from the hills. At approximately 2200 hours, someone on the perimeter reported lights on the water. Not searchlights, not gunfire, just lights, faint and bobbing, moving slowly from north to south along the coast. The report went up the chain, and within minutes every man on the beach was awake and staring into the darkness, trying to see what was out there. The lights grew brighter. They were ships, multiple ships, moving in a column maybe a mile offshore, running slow and low in the water. No one knew how many. No one knew what kind, but everyone knew what it meant. The Japanese were trying to land. The problem was that the American destroyers that were supposed to be patrolling the bay were not there. They had been pulled north to intercept another convoy, or they were refueling, or they were hunting submarines. The reports were never clear. What was clear was that the ships in the bay were Japanese. They were unescorted, and there was no one to stop them except the men on the beach. The infantry had mortars and machine guns, but the range was too far and the targets were too hard. The artillery was inland, repositioning after the landing, and could not get a firing solution in the dark. The only weapons on the beach with enough range and hitting power to matter were the M10s. The order came down at 22:15 hours. Engage the ships. Use high-explosive rounds if available. If not, use whatever you have. The crews looked at each other. High-explosive rounds were for bunkers and buildings, and the tank destroyers did not carry them. They carried armor-piercing rounds because that was what tank destroyers did. But orders were orders, and no one was about to sit on the beach and watch the Japanese land 2,000 men without a fight. Mackenzie's crew loaded a round, traversed the gun toward the water, and waited. The first problem was that they could not see the targets. The ships were out there, somewhere in the darkness, but the M10 did not have radar or rangefinders or any of the equipment that naval guns use to hit targets at night. They had eyes and math, and the hope that someone else would do something stupid first. At 22:20 hours, someone did. An American mortar team fired an illumination round over the bay. It was a standard 81mm flare, designed to light up an infantry position for 30 seconds and then burn out. It popped high over the water, a harsh white magnesium light that swung slowly beneath a parachute, and suddenly the bay was visible. 5 ships, maybe 6, small transports and barges low in the water packed with men and supplies. They were closer than anyone had thought, maybe 800 yards offshore, moving parallel to the beach. They were sitting targets. Mackenzie's gunner, a man named Private First Class Robert Harlan from Ohio, sighted on the lead ship. The range was long for the M10, but not impossible. The 3-inch gun had an effective range of about 2,000 yards against armored targets, and these ships were bigger and slower than any tank. Harlan adjusted for windage, adjusted for drop, and fired. The gun roared, the vehicle rocked back on its suspension, and the round screamed out across the water. 3 seconds later, it hit. The round punched through the side of the ship just above the waterline. It did not explode. Armor-piercing rounds were not designed to explode on contact with thin steel. They were designed to penetrate and then detonate inside the target. But the ship was not a tank. It was a transport, lightly built, packed with men and ammunition and fuel. The round went through the hull, through a bulkhead, and into a cargo hold filled with drums of gasoline. The drums ruptured. Gasoline sprayed across the hold, vaporized in the heat, and found a spark. The ship exploded. It was not a Hollywood explosion. It was not a fireball that rose into the sky and lit up the night. It was a deep, heavy whump of ignited fuel that blew out the sides of the ship and sent a column of black smoke rolling across the water. The ship listed immediately, men jumping over the sides, flames spreading across the deck. Within seconds, it was sinking. The flare burned out, darkness returned, and Mackenzie's crew reloaded. The mortar team fired another flare. The bay lit up again. The burning ship was still visible, now tilted at a severe angle, men in the water screaming in Japanese. But the other ships were still moving. They had not turned back. They had not scattered. They were still trying to make the beach because they had orders and because turning back meant facing the American destroyers that might be waiting in open water. It was a calculation, and they had chosen wrong. The other M10s opened fire. There were 6 tank destroyers positioned along the ridge, each with a crew that had trained for 2 years to kill German armor in the European theater and had instead been shipped to the Pacific to fight an enemy that barely used tanks. They had never fired at a ship before. They had never trained for it, but the principles were the same. Acquire the target. Estimate the range. Lead the target if it is moving. Fire. Adjust. Fire again. The 3-inch guns began to hammer, one after another, a rolling thunder that echoed across the bay and shook the ground beneath the infantry's foxholes. The second ship took 3 hits in under a minute. The first round missed, kicking up a geyser of water 50 yards short. The second round hit the stern, penetrating the engine compartment and detonating inside the fuel tanks. The ship lost power immediately, wallowing in the water, and the third round hit midship, blowing a hole in the hull large enough to drive a jeep through. The ship went down in less than 2 minutes, stern first, the bow rising out of the water and then sliding under with a hiss of steam and bubbles. The crew did not have time to abandon ship. Most of them went down with it. The third ship tried to run. It was a smaller vessel, a motorized barge designed to carry troops directly onto the beach. It had a flat bottom and a shallow draft, fast in calm water, and the captain must have thought he could outrun the guns by heading straight for shore. He was wrong. The M10s traversed smoothly, tracking the barge as it cut across the bay, and 3 guns fired simultaneously. 2 rounds missed. 1 hit. The round struck the barge just below the waterline, penetrated the hull, and detonated inside a compartment packed with soldiers. The barge disintegrated. There was no fire, no secondary explosion, just a sudden absence where the vessel had been, replaced by debris and bodies and a spreading slick of oil. The few survivors in the water did not make it to shore. The current pulled them out into the bay, and the darkness swallowed them. The 4th and 5th ships were larger transports, each carrying an estimated 300 men and several tons of supplies. They had been trailing the convoy, moving slower than the others, and when the first ships exploded they tried to reverse course. It was too late. The M10 crews had the range now, they had the rhythm, and the illumination flares kept coming, one every 30 seconds, lighting the bay in stuttering bursts of white light. The gunners did not need perfect visibility. They needed enough to see the outline of the target, enough to estimate the range, and enough time to fire before the light went out. They had all 3. The 4th ship took 2 hits in rapid succession, both rounds penetrating the hull and detonating inside the cargo holds. The ship caught fire, flames spreading from bow to stern, and within minutes the fire reached the ammunition. The explosion was enormous, a sharp crack followed by a rolling boom that rattled windows in the town 2 miles inland. The ship broke in half, both sections sinking within seconds, and the shockwave sent a wave rolling across the bay that rocked the surviving vessels and splashed up onto the beach. The men in the foxholes felt it, a physical punch of overpressure that left their ears ringing and their hands shaking. The M10 crews kept firing. The 5th ship did not explode. It simply sank. 4 rounds hit it in under 3 minutes, each one punching through the thin steel hull and letting the ocean pour in. The ship settled lower and lower in the water, the deck awash, men clinging to the railings and shouting for help that would not come. The captain tried to beach the vessel, running it aground on a sandbar about 400 yards from shore, but the damage was too severe. The ship rolled onto its side, spilling men and cargo into the water, and then slipped off the sandbar and disappeared. The survivors tried to swim for shore. Some made it. Most did not. The infantry on the beach watched them come, dark shapes thrashing in the surf, and opened fire with machine guns. It was not mercy. It was war. At 22:33 hours, 18 minutes after the first shot, the firing stopped. The bay was silent. The illumination flares had burned out and no one fired another. The darkness returned, thicker than before, and the only sound was the crackling of burning wreckage and the low moan of wounded men in the water. The M10 crews sat in their vehicles, ears ringing, hands still gripping the controls, waiting for another target. None came. The Japanese convoy was gone. 5 ships, approximately 750 men, all of it at the bottom of Ormoc Bay. The Americans had fired fewer than 50 rounds. They had suffered 0 casualties. Mackenzie and his crew did not celebrate. They reloaded their gun, traversed back to face the jungle, and waited for orders. The other crews did the same. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They had done something impossible, something that should not have worked, and now it was over. The night continued. The war continued, and the men who had just sunk 5 ships with tanks sat in the darkness and smoked cigarettes and tried not to think about the bodies in the water. The next morning the beach was littered with debris. Pieces of wood, life jackets, oil drums, ammunition crates, all of it washed ashore by the tide. The bodies came too, swollen and pale, tangled in the surf. The infantry collected them, counted them, and buried them in a mass grave inland. The official count was 732 dead. no prisoners, no survivors who made it off the beach alive. The Navy sent a patrol boat to survey the wrecks, and divers confirmed what everyone already knew. 5 ships, all sunk, all within a half-mile radius of each other, all showing penetration damage consistent with 3-inch armor-piercing rounds. The Japanese had lost an entire convoy, and the Americans had not lost a single man. The report went up the chain of command, and no one believed it. Tank destroyers do not sink ships. It was not doctrine. It was not possible. The 3-inch gun was designed for anti-armor work, not naval engagements, and armor-piercing rounds were not supposed to be effective against lightly armored vessels. The physics did not work. The tactics did not work. And yet the wrecks were there, sitting on the bottom of the bay, photographed and documented and undeniable. The Army sent investigators. They interviewed the crews. They examined the vehicles. They reviewed the firing logs and the ammunition expenditure reports, and eventually they concluded that yes, it had happened. The 77th Infantry Division, using M10 tank destroyers firing armor-piercing rounds, had sunk 5 Japanese vessels in 18 minutes from a static position on shore. It was the only confirmed instance in World War II of armored fighting vehicles engaging and destroying enemy warships from land. The tactical manual for the M10 was updated. A single line was added, buried in an appendix, noting that in certain circumstances, against lightly armored targets at close range, the 3-inch gun could be effective against naval vessels. No guidance was provided. No training was implemented. It was an acknowledgement, nothing more, that something strange had happened once and might happen again, though it never did. The Japanese tried again the next night. Another convoy, smaller this time, tried to slip into Ormoc Bay under the same conditions. The M10s were waiting. The result was the same. 2 more ships sunk, fewer casualties because the Japanese had learned to jump overboard sooner, but the same essential outcome. The convoy did not make it to shore. The reinforcements did not land. By December 13th, the Japanese had stopped trying. Ormoc Bay was closed. The 77th Infantry Division held the beach, and without reinforcements, the Japanese garrison on Leyte began to collapse. The island fell on December 26th. MacArthur moved on to Luzon. The war continued. The men of the 632nd Tank Destroyer Battalion did not talk about it much afterward. There were no medals, no commendations, no parade. The action was mentioned in the division's after-action report, a dry paragraph noting the engagement and the results, but it was not celebrated. The crews went on to fight in other battles, and some of them died in those battles, and the ones who survived went home after the war and did not tell the story. It was not that they were ashamed. It was not that they thought it was unimportant. It was that it had happened in the middle of a war where impossible things happened every day, and by the time it was over, one night on a beach in the Philippines did not seem like the kind of thing you talked about at dinner parties. Mackenzie survived the war. He went home to Pennsylvania, went back to the foundry, married, had children, and died in 1973 without ever writing down what happened that night. His crew scattered. Harlan went back to Ohio and worked in a hardware store. The loader, a man named Private Eugene Kessler from Iowa, became a school teacher. The driver, whose name was Private Leonard Briggs from Tennessee, died in a car accident in 1951. None of them spoke publicly about Ormoc Bay. There were no interviews, no documentaries, no books written by the men who were there. The story survived in official records, in after-action reports, in the updated tactical manual that almost no one read. But it did not survive in public memory. The reason is simple. The event was too strange to fit into the narrative of the war. World War II had tanks fighting tanks, ships fighting ships, planes fighting planes. There were categories, roles, doctrines that made sense and could be taught and repeated. Tank destroyers sinking ships did not fit. It was an anomaly, a fluke, a single night when everything went wrong for the Japanese and right for the Americans in a way that could not be replicated. The Navy did not want to acknowledge that they had not been there to stop the convoy. The Army did not want to celebrate a tactic that should not have worked and could not be turned into doctrine. And the men who did it did not want to explain why they had done something they were not trained to do, using weapons that were not designed for the job, and succeeded anyway. But it happened. On the night of December 11th, 1944, on a beach in the Philippines, a group of men who were too old for war and too stubborn to quit used tanks to sink ships. They fired 50 rounds, killed 750 men, and suffered 0 casualties. They changed the course of the Battle for Leyte, denied the Japanese the reinforcements they desperately needed, and proved that in war, there are no rules, only outcomes. The M10 tank destroyer was designed to fight German armor in the fields of France. It ended up fighting Japanese ships in the waters of the Pacific. And for 18 minutes, it did what it was never meant to do, and did it perfectly. The wrecks are still there at the bottom of Ormoc Bay, rusting in the salt water, slowly breaking apart and disappearing into the mud. No one has tried to raise them. No one has marked the location with a memorial. The bay is quiet now, the way it was before the war, and the only people who remember what happened there are historians who dig through old reports and find a paragraph that does not make sense and spend years trying to verify it. They find the reports. They find the photographs. They find the updated manual, and they conclude every time that yes, it happened. Tank destroyers sank ships. Once, only once, never again. The lesson, if there is one, is not about tactics or technology. It is about necessity. The men on that beach did not have the right tools, the right training, or the right doctrine. They had a mission, a target, and a weapon that might work if they were lucky. They fired and they were lucky, and 750 men died because of it. There is no glory in that. There is no moral. There is only the fact that it happened, and the men who did it went home and did not talk about it, and the war moved on and forgot them. But history does not forget. Somewhere in the records, in the files, in the after-action reports that no one reads anymore, the story is there. The night of December 11th, 1944, Ormoc Bay, Leyte, the 77th Infantry Division, the Old Bastards, the M10 tank destroyers, the 5 Japanese ships that tried to land and never made it, the 18 minutes that changed the battle, the 0 American casualties, the men who did the impossible and never spoke of it again. It happened, it was real, and it will never happen again. If you found this story as gripping as we did, please consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on the video. It helps us bring more untold stories from history to light. And we have a question for you. Knowing what you now know about that night in Ormoc Bay, do you think the silence of those veterans was about humility, or was it something else entirely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.